Once this becomes institutionalized, once it becomes the establishment, it becomes the focus of status competition. So you want to sort of ingratiate yourself with someone like with psychoanalysts, with people at these academic institutions. You want an advisor who's prominent. Well, you have to go with these people. And they are the power structure now. They're the people that control fellowships, graduate admissions. They control the money and the power. Once it's dominated by this intellectual perspective, there's enormous inertia. And that's one of our biggest problems now. These people have taken over the institutions. It's very hard to dislodge that because they police it very intensely. They have these informal networks dominating elite universities that operate as gatekeepers. You don't get in there unless you have the same ideas they have. So aspiring academics are subjected to a high level of indoctrination at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, and even going down through primary school, elementary school. So there's tremendous psychological pressure to adopt the viewpoints of the most elite people in your profession. If you're in anthropology, you naturally gravitate to being a Boasian. It's the only way to get ahead. That's what you all have been told your whole life. And once it attains this intellectual predominance, people become attracted to the prestige associated with it, of course. And if you are turned off by it, I think, and actually this paper by Fossey and Gross, their point is that if you are conservative, you don't resonate to all this political correctness in the university, you just don't become an academic. You go into business. You go into something that you don't have to be involved in the academic world. So the academic world self-selects for conservatives, against conservatives in favor of liberals and radicals, multiculturalists, and so on. So dissenters are shunned, they're ostracized, they're denied tenure, they don't get grants, and they don't get promoted. In my case, I had tenure when I started writing this. I didn't really know about any of this stuff until after I got tenure, and then I started getting into it. But if I had written it without tenure, I certainly would have gotten fired. In fact, they have attempted to fire me since then, but they have failed, fortunately. And I mentioned here, Helmut Nyberg is in the room here, and he's gone through an awful lot. He had a paper on sex differences, and I'm sure some of his more recent work will also get him in a lot of trouble with the establishment here in Denmark. But people like Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer, these are the people that wrote a book called The Israel Lobby. And they're basically saying, the Israel lobby is very powerful. It does not necessarily have the same interests as the United States does. But they were harassed. They were, said they compared them to the protocols of the elders of Zion. I mean, this is ridiculous. Stephen Walt's a Harvard professor. Mearsheimer's at the University of Chicago. These are very elite people, very intelligent. They are liberal. They're not, they're not associated with any, even like I am, They're not like me. They're good people. But the point is, they were vilified. They said it's the worst sort of anti-Semite, just evil, evil, evil. And I heard secondhand from them that they were, they knew they'd get some static when they wrote this book, but they had no idea how intense it would be, that the vilification they would get from this Jewish activist organization, the people in Israel, complaining about shoddy scholarship. These are Harvard professors, all of a sudden they have shoddy scholarship. Nobody ever complained about their scholarship before. And they have huge amounts of footnotes and all that. And the people complaining about shoddy scholarship by these guys are people who have never done any scholarship. It's outrageous. Phil Rushton in Canada, who's done IQ and race differences research, and E.O. Wilson, who's the guy who founded the sociobiology, got it on the map. He was vilified by the left, and a lot of that's actually part of Chapter 2 of Culture of Critique. I talk about the attack on E.O. Wilson by Richard Lewontin, Stephen Jay Gould, Kamen, and all these. Really, it was a Jewish movement. And it's one of the good things about John Glad's recent book on Jewish eugenics. He just comes out and says, these were Jews going after E.O. Wilson, trying to beat back this resurgence of biology. In other words, you had a predominance of Darwinism in the early part of the 20th century, completely wiped out by Boas and all that. Now, suddenly, some guy comes along at Harvard, E.O. Wilson, and trying to reinstate it. And then you had people like Rushton, people like Nyberg, people taking IQ seriously, taking race differences seriously. It hadn't been done in decades. So that's, I want to just conclude with I didn't print this out, so I'm going to have to read it. But collectively, these movements called into question the fundamental moral, political, and economic foundations of Western society. The critical feature of the movements is that they have been top-down movements in the sense that they were originated and dominated by members of a highly intelligent, well-educated group. And again, that fits well with what we know, the sociology of science. Science, the changes happen at the top in the intellectual world. These movements have been advocated with great intellectual passion and moral fervor and a high level of theoretical sophistication. I'm not saying they're right, but they're often very convoluted, difficult to read and all that. Each movement promises its own overlapping and complementary vision of utopia. A society composed of people with the same biological potential for accomplishment could be easily molded by culture into ideal citizens as imagined by a morally and intellectually superior elite. Again, all these movements were basically movements that said that this intellectual elite should determine the policy. Don't listen to the people. A classist society, of course that's the Marxist, in which there was no conflicts of interest, people would altruistically work for the common good of the group, which violates all the principles of evolutionary biology. But nevertheless, that became the dogma among the Marxist left. A society in which people would be free of neuroses and aggression towards outgroups, in tune with their biological urges. Of course, that's psychoanalysis. Any hatred or unhappiness you have with somebody from another group is because of some kind of repression, kind of thing. A multicultural paradise in which different racial and ethnic groups live in harmony and cooperation. A utopian dream that is a central part of the discussion of immigration policy in one of the chapter 7, I guess. Each of these utopias is profoundly problematic from an evolutionary perspective. For example, social science data shows quite clearly that multiculturalism is associated with increased conflict, with political alienation, lack of willingness to contribute to public goods. People do not want to contribute to health care and education of people unlike themselves. In America, there's huge reluctance now to contribute tax money, because people understand that their tax money is going to millions of Mexicans in the school system, millions of Mexicans who can't pay for their health care and so on. And they're not like them. If they were other white people, it would be a different story. The originators of these movements were all vitally concerned with anti-Semitism, and all the utopias envisioned by the intellectual movements would end anti-Semitism while allowing Jewish group continuity. In other words, none of these movements ever questioned the idea that there was something possibly wrong with Judaism, that maybe something they were doing was a problem. The generation of Jewish radicals looked to the Soviet Union as an idyllic place where Jews could rise to prominence and where anti-Semitism was officially outlawed, while consistently downplaying the slaughters, the mass murders, and all that kind of stuff. The psychoanalytic movement, the Frankfurt School, looked forward to the day when Gentiles would be inoculated against anti-Semitism by a clinical priesthood that could heal the personal inadequacies and the frustrations that loss of status that non-Jews murderously projected onto Jews. And the Boasians in the Frankfurt School and their descendants would prevent the development of anti-Semitic ideologies of majoritarian ethnocentrism. Majoritarian ethnocentrism is now seen as the biggest problem for Jews. A palpable sense of intellectual and moral superiority of those participating in these movements is another characteristic feature. This sense of intellectual superiority and hostility to non-Jews and their culture is a recurrent theme of the leftist movements I discussed in Chapter 3, and a profound sense of intellectual superiority and estrangement from Gentile culture characterized not only Freud but the entire psychoanalytic movement. The sense of superiority on the part of a, quote, self-constituted cultural vanguard, as Christopher Lasch called in a famous book, of Jewish intellectuals toward lower middle class mores and attitudes was a theme on the Frankfurt School. Regarding moral superiority, the pose of post-Enlightenment intellectuals is a sense that Judaism represents a moral beacon to the rest of humanity. These movements thus constituted concrete examples of the ancient and recurrent Jewish self-conceptions of a light unto the nations. Moral indictments of their opponents are a prominent theme in the writings of political radicals and those opposing biological perspectives on individual and group differences in IQ. A sense of moral superiority was also prevalent in the psychoanalytic movement, and we have seen the Frankfurt School develop a moral perspective in which the existence of Judaism was viewed as an a priori moral absolute, and which social science was judged by moral criteria. Think about that. Social science is not judged by whether it's true, but whether it has some moral good to it. Finally, the culture critique is the culture of Western suicide. It is maintained by powerful social controls, ostracism, loss of employment, imputations of moral turpitude, and psychiatric disturbance. All the high points of our society now are rigorously policed. Very difficult to see how to break through this. I sometimes don't know how we're going to do it. Revolutions are top-down. All the successful ones have been. The high points are very strongly controlled. There's perhaps some hope for a bottom-up revolution via anti-immigration parties in Europe. And again, I have more hope for Europe, and maybe I'm delusionary, but I don't see anything happening in America for quite a while. We just, it's like, just can't seem to organize anything against immigration. And regarding talking about today, I do think that America may be in decline. We are in economic retreat. We're having a very prolonged recession. We could well be. We're not going to get out of it, really. We are overextended militarily. We're massively in debt. The dollar is being devalued all the time. I'm amazed how expensive things are in Denmark, actually. So I do think that may be good news, because America has been very influential. And there is no question that the Jewish intellectual elites do dominate American intellectual scene. No culture or civilization can long endure when its basic intellectual and moral foundations are called into question. The result has been a lack of cultural confidence that has left the West unable to resist calls for massive immigration from other peoples and cultures, with a long-term prospect that the traditional peoples and culture of the West will disappear entirely. This is why it is vitally important that we understand the ethnic motivations at the heart of this critique of Western culture. We should not be surprised to find that there's ethnic conflict in the intellectual realm any more than we're surprised to see it in the political realm. We're not surprised to see in America blacks voting a certain way or Mexicans and so on. But we have to understand that could happen in the intellectual world, that Jews do see themselves as separate and have this access to ground that we've talked about. Ethnic differences are a routine source of conflict around the world, and there are dire consequences to those who lose. It really doesn't matter if it's a military conquest or an intellectual conquest, a gradual death that we're seeing now. You're still losing this evolutionary game. Our genes will be at much lower percentages than they are in the future, than they are now. So we haven't developed confidence to say that other people should remain in their countries, develop their own cultures. We can easily say why all these people want to come here, and to America and so on. But if we don't do that, our culture, our people will ultimately be destroyed. We in the West are unique in all the cultures of the world, having developed cultures with a large measure of individual freedom, representative government, and economic well-being. We've developed powerful scientific methods that result in incredible progress. We should all be intensely motivated to prevent the destruction of this incredible achievement. Thank you.